everyone. We're here, and this is going to be the second episode of the meaning crisis. What do you call this? It's not exactly like we're not doing the meaning crisis, but we are talking about the meaning crisis by Dr. Viveki, and we shall put a link to the meaning crisis series in the description below. And so today we're going to be discussing the second episode of it. And before we begin, just a quick mention to our sponsor at Young You Organics and providing us with this white sage smudge spray that we like to ritualistically spray before each podcast. And so you can find this on youngyouorganics.com, and I shall put a link in the description of the podcast where you can go and you can find it. And it's a really pleasant spray, and it has sage and lemongrass and rosemary and palo santo, sea salt, and a few crystals in there. And I like to invoke the spirits of this smudge spray to balance me and harmonize me and to ground me and to just bring a pleasantness to the space itself. And so, yeah, go get yourself some.
I use my smudge spray to be mindful.
There you go. There you go. It's a good use. Be mindful.
Yeah, be aware.
Be aware. Brilliant.
So the
So,
meaning crisis, I jumped in first. In
all
case
you.
you haven't seen our previous episode, Dr. Ravaki is proposing that there is a meaning crisis. And despite the fact that people are more interested in mindfulness and um, other practices that promote mindfulness, there is also a rise of depression and mental health, and also many other crises happening on our planet currently. Some people, anyway, I'm gonna stop that thought right there. And so he is looking back in time and talking about how we got to where we are now, meaning how I think the human mind has been created, maybe how the current kind of like culture got to the place in which we are now.
Yeah, and so he in the first two episodes gives us so far the history of it, and we're still um personally watching these episodes to figure out sort of where it's going. But he talks a lot about shamanism in the two episodes, and a in intellectually he seems to be researching it and coming to the conclusion that shamanism is a way to bring about changes to the brain to be able to recognize patterns in a way that might not have been previously available. And he calls this a psychotechnology. And I think that's accurate in terms of what the shamanic practice does, because what the shamanic practice is a recognition, recognizing of the one spirit, or I don't even want to say or, but just the one spirit, which can be related to God or universe or source, which is spirit, which is this big spirit, great spirit, as it's been called, and then turning that into individual spirits. And so when you do that, you recognize that everything is a spirit, even including your own mental states, and that as you explore these principles, you start to gain an understanding of these patterns. And as I was trained in modern shamanism, there's a specific term for it, and it's called spiritual lattice. And so that's just understanding how spirit is made of spirits and recognizing what spirits make the spirit. So, as an example, it might be a crude example, but most people can relate to this in that, okay, if you think of a pizza and this pizza to shamans would be a spirit, it has its own thing to it. And so we would call that a spirit. And this pizza spirit, this one pizza spirit, is made up of all of its individual ingredients, and all these individual ingredients are their own spirits. So you got the flour spirit and the water spirit. You combine that to make the dough spirit, probably some salt spirit in there. And then you have the tomato sauce spirit and the cheese spirit. And so that is an example of how a spirit is made of spirits. And so as you explore this, you start to recognize patterns that you may not have recognized before you started learning to reframe reality in this way. And so that is something that I can state from my own personal direct experience of shamanism and spirit of what he is talking about.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm curious if people who are listening understand because they don't know what he was saying. So to begin with, Dr. Viveki was explaining that it was shamanism or shaman that helped move the from the Paleolithic era kind of helped give a little push into a more innovative understanding framework of a mind. I don't know if I said that right or if I said that in a way that makes sense.
It makes sense. Totally.
It was it was through shamanism that the mind evolved out of the Paleolithic era, is what he's saying. And he in the text was giving the example of how this happened through um, a flow state where then you could recognize patterns in a different way and make new and different connections that you weren't already making before. And then
Yes.
you are explaining how shaman do this or how you were taught to do it in modern shamanism
Right. Right.
through the
So,
understanding that everything is spirit. And then the spiritual lattice is how all spirits of a certain thing are related or interrelated.
right. Right. So that spiritual lattice of the pizza is all of those individual ingredient spirits that make up the one pizza spirit. And so that was what I was referring to, what he was referring to with changing in the brain pattern through different types of understandings that really start to build a new reality. And um, he mentions too about bringing this brain change through plant medicines or chanting or dancing or all of these ones that are already known. And um, I just thought it important to mention too that those are great techniques to be able to enter into an what would be called an altered state to be able to see things in a different way. And it's also, I thought, important to mention with these different types of understandings too, and conveying them to everyone who's listening, um, that can also bring about changes in the way that we frame and that we think about things. And when you reframe something, it brings about a different way of viewing it. So I was just giving my own experience of what he was talking about or how I interpreted what he was talking about.
Yeah, I think I understand that, but I just wanted to say how he didn't say what he was talking about to begin with,
Yeah,
really.
sorry. I do like the really one thing that he said is that this is a quote, is shamanism is a practice of getting into the flow state or being at one, doing your best at what you excel in. I just like that doing at best at what you excel in. It's like
Well, yeah, it's fun
inspiring.
to do the things that come easy to you. It sucks doing the things that feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, but for anyone out there who is really interested in the shamanic practice, like know that it brings about and highlights all of the areas in which you personally struggle. And so it's not just like rainbows and unicorns. Although I mean it is a lot of rainbows, but it's not all um easy. It's some of it can be very challenging. So I just wanted to state that as if you are interested in the shamanic practice and you're just beginning and you're watching this, that there are certain challenges and it's not all easy. In fact, a lot of it can be very, very challenging. But that flow state of what he mentions, and he just kind of he gives the scientific understanding of it. Um, Anything to add on that?
On what specifically? The flow state. Shamanism is not easy.
I just yeah, all of
The
it.
life of a shaman is not all rainbows and butterflies. Although I wouldn't know. I don't
It's
actually
definitely
consider myself a shaman.
I've just went through the practice.
But shamanic tools certainly, I'm not sure if they make life any easier. They do give it a different spin.
Certainly.
Something that I think he said, which I felt was interesting, is, and you talked about this, is the reframing. So, like, the way that we frame things really has an impact on where, you do the framing, and then that takes you, you kind of are beholden to that frame. And there's a lot of misframing. Um, and I think
Leading to the meeting
that's,
practice.
yeah, yeah. And then I think what's also interesting is you can reframe. So that's really helpful. But you kind of have to see like where it went wrong and then do all this unraveling to get back to the basics. So of course, whatever he's talking about is, you had mentioned this, it's whatever history or timeline is available to us. And then
Yeah, I
it's his
mentioned this one.
interpretation of that information. And is all this information even accurate to begin with?
Yeah, yeah. I mentioned this off air when we were talking about how mm, okay, what was the first era? It was I'm sorry.
Well, about
It was
misframing, or
yeah.
his first, what you felt like the first era was.
Oh, the Paleolithic era. Sorry.
Oh, era. I didn't, oh, okay, I didn't understand what your question was.
Yeah, so a a lot of um what he is talking about as far as going from the Paleolithic era to the um era, I forget the name of it specifically, but like when we start farming, and then it leads to the Bronze Age and then the Axial Age. As far as um as far as the timeline goes, it what he's talking about is dependent that the timeline is actually the timeline in which we as a species started to discover things like, being in the Bronze Age from 3300 to about 1200 BCE, and building the pyramids in that time. There is evidence to support that these structures may be well older than what we might have initially thought they were. And so, in my opinion, I think that what he's talking about is really relegated to that timeline. And not to say like that all of what he's saying, you know, might be based on a false conclusion. There's a lot of really good truths in there and some um, ways of thinking about things that are very helpful. But I think it is also noteworthy to mention about the timeline and just like you said, like the information that we're given. And this also too, if it leads to a lack of meaning when we falsely conclude. And so if we falsely conclude the timeline of, okay, it's this way, the pyramids were built this time, and that's it, right? Like you hear a lot of that in um, Egyptology. And then there's no room then for new discoveries. So that's what I mean about the false conclusions of, I think it's important to when we're finding meaning to be open to there being more and to not falsely conclude anything. But it's a normal part of the human psyche. So going back to like
Yeah,
where we can find a meaning crisis.
I think that yeah, we're limited in what research has been done and what is available to research and what is written down and what has been figured out and who wrote it down. All of these things come into play. And I think that's part of why I don't know like, what I want to say works. Part of why like the reality that we're all living in today like kind of works, but is also like not exactly accurate. It's like
Yeah,
kind of missing the mark, but like look how far we came.
yeah, yeah. I think
Like it
what
could
you're
have been
saying,
all wrong. Like here we are talking over a computer, right? Like I'm literally staring into a computer screen.
yeah, I don't think it could have
And
been
I
all wrong.
see you. So, I mean, right. And then just like, nothing is all wrong and nothing is all right. There's always like, there's so much tiny, like little details and everything, and so many
Yeah,
different ways of seeing things. And again, I think that's where those constraints, and then I forget what that thing, the opposite of the constraint is, but that's, what builds the frame and what we're dealing with.
yes, yes. And going back to talking about the shamanic practice of when there is a framework that no longer works for us, we have to then explore new frameworks, which requires that exploration beyond maybe the known and finding a new way of framing reality that is based in truth. And so, going and referring to the whole title of the meaning crisis is when we have our framework and we are framing in false conclusions, this is what leads to the meaning crisis because we are falsely concluding something to be some way other than the actual way that it is. And so it can't be all wrong. I totally agree with you on that. And I think part of healing from the meaning crisis is looking at the parts that are not working for us anymore. Maybe they worked in the past, but maybe today they just don't work. And that's like one aspect of it. And there might be some aspects where it just never worked. And like digging deep into that and then, finding where these false conclusions are that are creating this meaning crisis and fixing them. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to lead to healing for our species and specifically the psyche, and just going to reverberate into everything.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what he's doing with this. I think we have to understand how something came about to see how it was framed.
Yeah. And that's what I really appreciate about this series. And because it's not easy. Like, number one, it's not easy to address false conclusions in yourself because going back to that framework. So if you just look at it individually, if you falsely conclude something, you have that framework, and then eventually, somewhere along the line, that bubble that you built is gonna be burst. Like there's one thing about false conclusion and or delusion is that it can be maintained for a period of time, but eventually they all will fall. And so once that happens and like that bubble gets burst, that framework starts to come down, that's when the personal struggle and the challenges come about because then you have to build something new that ultimately um, is going to be not based on that false conclusion anymore. And so if you look at that individually, you could see where the challenges are. Now you multiply that by our whole history and what he's talking about, like this is a very, very complex issue.
Yeah. That's why sometimes I feel like let's just stop. I'm so interested in learning how he perceives that everything was framed. But I'm also sometimes like, well, let's just forget all that stuff and just look to where we want to go. But I do think the looking back has some kind of, I don't know, importance or significance. Maybe looking back on it with like a neutrality, right? Rather than being mad or holding any kind of anything against it, other than it was what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important for our own well-being. And I mean, I would invite really the Buddhas and Siddhartha to just come in and really, teach us about compassion because I mean, ultimately, like if we could understand it as an individual and understand all of our own false conclusions, we and understand it through the lens of compassion. Well, I think then we can, see like, okay, I'm a human being. Like the people that were before me, they were human beings too. And like, yeah, I might not have created, the whole system that could lead to a lot of false conclusions and illusions and delusions, but I can have compassion for them, just, being alive and figuring this thing out too, because ultimately, like, they didn't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers. And so, yeah, just going back to like it being very complex. And yeah, I agree with you in a sense where like to solve it, we have to keep moving forward. We can't just be caught up in the past, but we also have to understand like what the past really was.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm being patient throughout this series, and I mean it's only lecture two, so we'll see. We'll see at the end how it stacks up.
Yeah, I'm curious to know. I mean, Dr. Vervecki seems very well researched. So I think it's fun to see it through his lens and to see, oh, this is how things, one version of how things happened.
Yeah.
And I think he does kind of mention that. I had a little bit where he talks about, I forget if it's like Plato or Socrates, and he's like, I'm just presenting the view of this man based on what I understand and from what I've read. So I think also does recognize that, you know, he talks about it too. Like everything we talk about is a metaphor, right? We're never actually talking about the thing.
Yeah.
It's always some kind of extrapolation. And then I think that is always going to bring us back to like, there's always something just like not exactly right. When you take like what something actually is and then start representing it as we are doing with language.
Because yeah, totally. It's a fascinating thought to say like, okay, computer, me saying computer is the word for the computer, but not the actual computer itself. It's just the
Yeah.
word for it's just the word computer. And so it's just, complete symbology of the thing itself, not the thing itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, I think, how we interact oftentimes with life, with the interpretation or our understanding of a thing that isn't actually the thing.
False conclusion. That's what you're saying. Is if we conclude that thing to be the word, well, no, it's just the thing, and the word is the word for the thing.
I think there's something like slightly different than in a false conclusion. I think if you're doing it with like the awareness that it's happening, it's just inevitable in the way, again, that the mind and that everything before us has created how we are communicating. And again, how we talked about, like, there's just so much benefit in it. Like, look how much has come from the symbolic representation of things.
Oh yeah, yeah. I know what you mean. I wasn't saying like that when you're aware of it. When you're aware of it, that's when you're not falsely concluding. I'm saying when you believe it to
Mm-mm-mm.
be the thing
Okay, I see what you're
itself
saying.
rather than just the word, that would be where we could fall into that false conclusion and just live solely based in our own language.
Yeah. And I think that's part of like what's going on today a little bit is that we do live so up in our heads as opposed to being like fully embodied. And then I think in the body is where you could get, we were talking about this, you could get those trans personal things or information or spirit that you otherwise would not have gotten that don't come from thought alone, but there are these qualities that we're capable of. So our insight and our intuition and our forget what the other ones are now. What did I say? Insight. Oh, inspiration. I think there's one more. Insight,
Insight,
intuition,
inspiration.
inspiration. Did I say intuition?
Yes. Uh, I
Well,
don't know. I think you got it covered there.
I'm not gonna remember right now.
Oh,
But
implicit learning.
well,
I was thinking,
implicit learning is when you learn something directly. I forget what the implicit learning is. I know we just talked about this. Um, and I forget what I was even saying with that. I have this thing where I could talk and then forget like what I'm talking about.
join the club.
Implicit learning is the learning of complex information in an unintentional manner. Oh, intention. That's the other
Ah, there
I-N,
you go.
like the other ways of um yeah, like knowing, communicating, operating. And I think a lot of these things have been, are trumped in our culture by rational thinking, right? Like if your mind didn't come up with it, then I don't know if there's like value to it. And then I think that leads to I think that probably leads to a lot of the meaning crisis because we're just disconnected from our own selves, our own truth. I mean, I was thinking of it today. We talked about this earlier, how like, you know, I learned maybe not directly, but just through being in the field of other people and other situations that like somehow I shouldn't like the way I look. Like I shouldn't like how my body looks. Like what the fuck? Like the only way I'm here is because I have this body, and the only thing my body has done for me is been alive and lived and taken care of me and functioned. I mean, but yet I was taught to attack it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, it's
just
sad,
nuts.
our social conditioning. Yeah, it's so sad. I think it's really sad when we learn social conditioning that is not for the benefit of our own well-being.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I had something. Now I've left. Going back to forgetting what I was talking about as I'm talking about it. Yeah. Gonna laugh at myself.
I don't know.
Oh, okay. So I totally agree with what you're saying about, you know, how we're taught to be very mind dominant and that there is a whole other form of knowing that is not just in the mind. And it seems to be a duality that we get taught that creates this mind dominance. And then it can sort of flip of like, okay, we need to like not be in the mind and we need to be in the body. And oftentimes I see that as just a flip verse of that duality of like body, mind, body, which one is it? And I think that to gain these, he mentioned that the more you're in flow, the more you are capable of tuning into insights. Now, we could call it whatever you would like, flow, awareness, consciousness, being aware of all of it. I don't think it really matters. But what I do think matters is that um, we understand the totality of our being in our totality of our brain and the brain's functioning, which we call the mind, and then the whole rest of the body all at once. And so that it's just whole body,
Oh
whole
yeah.
body. Not we're not separating it out like the mind is part of the body as equally as the heart is a part of the body, as the pinky and the thumbnail and like, the whole thing. And I really like what you mentioned too about when you're just mind dominant, you are turning then off other stimuli that may be coming to you in forms of insights and intuitions and all of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's beneficial to not think of just the mind and the body. I mean, they're not separate, and to think of it as holistically. I mean, and in fact, like what creates the mind is not just the brain, but the body.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that touches upon the meaning crisis in the way of when we think about the mind as being somehow separate from the body, even though we know that to be false, but we get taught like, oh, it's just the mind or whatever. Like, oh, it's just your mind. You know? Um, we can frame that dualistically and then separate it out, and when we do that, that creates the false conclusion, the illusion that somehow the mind is separate from the body itself, and then that leads into a meaning crisis.
Yeah, and that's something I think people are still recognizing today, that the mind and the body are not separate.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I could speak to my own experience when I discovered that it wasn't separate. Like it was like a total light bulb moment, like, aha, it's not separate after all. All right. Then like things really started to turn on for me and just in understanding the body and the brain as an organ in the body and then what the brain is doing as this interpretation organ and what the rest of the body is doing. I think that's actually something that I learned in the Total Awakening course of Blue Morpho's work, which I'll put a link in to the description for anyone who wants to do that course. I highly recommend it for just as I'm stating, of it really just turning on the whole body and getting understand the whole body as the body, including the mind and the brain's function as this interpretation organ. And so it doesn't have to be somehow separate. That's sort of like when I released that duality in my experience and started
Yeah,
to have these new understandings, these new frameworks, and seeing these new patterns going back to, the shamanism and being aware of these patterns.
I had a ceremony one time. I just ended up laughing at myself because I must have repeated this thought like multiple times. Like my brain was like, I guess I felt like I couldn't connect to something. And I was like, I'm separate from my body. I can't do it. I'm separate from my body. And I just like noticed what my brain, what my mind was saying. You're nuts. Like you can't be separate. I guess not nuts. That's just my, my laughing at myself of like how mentally insane my brain mind can be sometimes if I'm not
Yeah.
aware and I let it go unchecked.
Well, we go insane when we believe in these false conclusions. I'm just calling them false conclusions, but just so everyone's aware, right? False conclusion, I think, is a much nicer term, but I'm meaning all of this synonymously when I say false conclusion is synonymous with delusion. And but but when you were telling me that, it reminded me of what this one maestra shaman told me one time, and she's told me that when we find our false conclusions or delusions or these illusions in our psyche that have been given to us by society, we just gotta laugh at ourselves. Like that's the best thing to do is just laugh at yourself. And
Yeah.
then I was reminded of a poem that she wrote that I read, and there's like a little snippet of it, and it's like the jolly Buddha. He laughs at you, he laughs at me because we all take ourselves so seriously. It's just
Yeah. I think
going
it's
back to that
important.
compassion, yeah, and just laughing
Yeah.
at your.
It's so important to not take it so seriously. Because everyone has it and everyone's doing it and everyone's plagued by it.
Absolutely. I really, in my opinion, I think when we start to answer these questions of how do we solve our own meaning crisis individually and do what we can individually, there's a part where it needs to go to the collective. But when we ask ourselves that on an individual level, if everyone started asking that, we would be out of this meaning crisis in no time at all. But
I do think
not
it's,
everyone's aware.
yeah, I do think it's definitely important that you realize for yourself what actually is meaningful for you. And then you could, I mean, that opens up a whole nother can of worms as well, because then, I mean, maybe you you know, find the thing that you feel is meaningful might not have as much meaning as you originally thought.
Yeah, and that's part of the exploration too, of, finding these um these things that cause lack of meaning in your psyche. And so if it's something that uh like I would go on, or if it's something that I would be thinking about and believing in that I thought had a lot of meaning for me, but I was falsely concluding something. And then I realized, like, oh shit, I was falsely concluding that thing. Well, going back to like that advice, like, what's the best thing to do? Well, you laugh at yourself and you move on.
Yeah, but that's a lot easier said than done if your false conclusion is like what brings meaning to me is having $1 billion in the bank, right? I mean, it's not like it just took waking up and going to the store and getting the $1 billion in your bank. It took what it took. So then to just laugh at all that, oops.
Are you meaning are you meaning
Oops.
like a person who is like, all right, that's really meaningful for me, and then actually goes out and does it and like gets $1 billion in their bank account?
No, I'm saying you do it all, and then the advice you gave is if everyone reflects on what is actually meaningful for them.
Okay, I see what you're saying. You know, actually, you bringing that up, I really resonate with that, considering that for a long time, one of my goals was to make $1 million. And only recently I saw that the lack of meaning was in how. Like, I still want to make $1 million, but how do I want to do it? You know, um, where I saw my lack of meaning was I just want it. I just wanted to have it, right? But like for me, that I saw as like, well, there's no meaning to it if what I'm doing is not based within my own integrity and what I'm passionate about. So I just then I actually took that advice. I laughed, and then I just moved forward, and I am now reframing this pattern in my psyche of like earning money, but like earning money doing something that I'm passionate about and that I'm good at. And um so I'm going on that journey of, doing that, earning money of what I'm passionate about and good at, and earning enough from it to have a comfortable living, whatever that number is. Like, I just don't want to be caught up in the number anymore.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think also to look at like, right, what meaning would or what would be different in your life if you had that $1 million, regardless of how you got it? Like, what significance would that play in your life? Because I feel like there probably is some meaning there, but it's like a symbol of something else.
Right. It's I for me personally, it would be a symbol for more freedom of doing what I want when I want. Of like, okay, I have the money now, I could pay off my debts, and then I could just like if I wanted to go travel for an extended period of time, and I can, you know, live off that and, do courses and learn and do all these other kinds of things that I want to do. So like having enough money to live comfortably and do what I'm passionate about is still there. But just like having $1 million just to have $1 million, that was where I found like the lack of meaning. But like having it for purpose, I think that's where like uh, the meaning would be for me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have $1 million. I wish I did.
I think it also probably brings a lot of, I don't know, real safety, but maybe a feeling of safety as well.
Mm, yeah,
Maybe the thought of safety.
the thought of safety. Yeah, I would agree with that.
All
Hmm.
that to say, look how many ways you could examine this goal that you have in terms of to find the meaning in it. And I think that's why it's just easier said than done if everyone just explored for themselves, like, what is meaning? What has meaning? Of course, little by little, it would certainly help.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only real way that we as a collective wake up from what is it that's ailing us.
I'm gonna say
No matter how
that's,
hard.
I'm just gonna say that's not the only way. I don't know what the other ways are. I'd have to sit and think of it, but I just think for such a complex problem, we can't say there's only one way to do it. Because I
Okay, okay.
think that might be
I'll agree
right
with
for
you.
you. That path might be right for you to examine what brings you meaning, right? Other people might not frame it in that way. And maybe what they, I don't know, maybe the meaning doesn't have, like finding meaning doesn't have meaning for them, or maybe they even just, I don't know. I'm just kind of like thinking that everyone has to have a way to contribute to the awakening. And I
You
suppose like
know,
you want to have a life that has meaning.
yes, I want to live meaningfully, but I want to go back to answering that question individually. Okay, maybe
What
there,
question?
maybe that's not the only way. I'll agree with you on that. I don't know what the other way would be either, but I don't know if like anyone's saying like, you know what, I really want to live unmeaningfully. Like the meaning does is not really important for me. I think that, there's a very common desire to live meaningfully among everyone. I think that's an innate, it's within us, and I don't know. Is there someone out there who's like, I just fuck it. I don't want to really live a meaningful existence. Like I'm happy just sitting here eating Cheetos on my mom's couch.
Well, that's distracting. And I think some people maybe have had a lot that they had to soothe and distract from. So I don't know if the question for them is what's meaningful, but maybe it's something
Mm.
else, and then
Yeah, maybe it's
their
like
way
what.
of getting there isn't necessarily asking what's meaningful, but it would be like, what would make me happy, right? Maybe you start out with like, what would make me happy, which isn't exactly what brings meaning, you know? Because like I was happy when I ate that that ice cream cake that I made for Louis, but like, do I want to do that all the time? No. But I was happy at the time. I used to think like being happy was the thing I wanted or what would
Mm.
bring meaning, but I'm realizing now that that's not what it is either. I definitely agree. I think there's like something inherent in us that we want to feel like we have a purpose, a value, a place, um, that we're contributing in some meaningful way. I think some people probably have a lot more of the like cleaning up to do.
Yeah,
A
oh,
lot of
totally.
people before they could get to that meaning part. I think is That's why I'm saying it's not the only way. I think that's where it comes from.
I'm so glad you put it like that, of like the cleaning up part, because we were having pretty much the same thought. And like going to just the example of like the person sitting there getting overweight, eating Cheetos on their mom's couch and not really like having much of a contribution or contribution, like cleaning up that part of yourself, not saying like you personally, or just like cleaning up that part of you, again, not you personally, or me, not me personally, but like cleaning that up and finding the meaning in that person who is behaving that way would have to ask, what is the meaning that I'm getting from this? Like, what meaning am I having by sitting here on the couch getting overweight eating Cheetos? And I mean, that's a question, I'm sure a lot of people would have to ask themselves. And that is like where that challenging aspect comes in of, you know, like you said, the distraction from what's really hurting them, because like it hurts so bad that they just don't want to deal with it. And it's not always easy becoming aware and awakening to really, what in our psyche is hurting us. And so sometimes it's just easier to distract. But I think for the health and well-being of the individual and the health and the well-being of us as a collective, that we got to answer those questions. I think it's a necessity. to be able then to move beyond it and move beyond the suffering into something that is more pleasurable and ultimately where I think where we'd find great meaning in our lives of, just living a pleasurable life and living comfortably and living well and living healthy. Like, what meaning do we get out of that? Well, we have a good existence, simply put.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I just think there's, different approaches to getting to the same kind of, the same, I don't know, path or end, or, if it's the end outcome, or maybe just getting towards somewhere that is more kind and generous and loving and sustainable and works for more people than how things are currently working for people now.
Yeah.
I mean, we are talking about meaning, so yeah, I feel like that is the question that we're contemplating.
Mm.
But I can also see, right, how for some people that's not everything, or that's not what it would be right now, maybe
Yeah.
eventually. And I also would like to say that, do you know, sometimes like soothing and distracting is actually a healthy, it is a healthy thing to do. It's not all
I think,
negative.
no, it's not on. Yeah, I, I always think it's a question of like how much.
Yeah.
Like if you're distracting yourself when you have something really important to do, or maybe like in the framing of it, of like the video game, some people would say like be like completely dualistic of like video games are distractions. That's it. That's all they are. Like, no, I don't think that's like all they are, but you can use them as a distraction. Like if you have something that you really, need to engage in, but you are scared or whatever the thing is that is blocking you from engaging that, I would consider that to be like the spirit of distraction in which um it gets you doing something other than what you actually need to do. And so, but like sometimes like you need to play some video games, you need to like watch some TV, you need to like have some good quality entertainment to like soothe
Yeah, I mean, sometimes
what
you
you're
don't
talking
have
about.
all of the capabilities or the capacity to confront the thing that you're being asked to confront. So rather
Yeah,
than do something you're incapable of, you distract. And that's like
yeah.
the actual healthier option than like getting overwhelmed and possibly, um, whatever comes from that. I mean, think about what happens like when you get really frustrated at something and you keep at it rather than just maybe pausing and distracting yourself for a few minutes by doing something that's more pleasurable or more enjoyment, or could help you to kind of, if you don't have skills or the tools to feel in your body, to at least just distract your mind and then go back to the thing that was so frustrating, because I mean, I know how that feeling is in my body. It just gets to the point you can't, the feeling is so overwhelming that you can't do the thing.
I think maybe where we have a difference is that what I'm calling distraction is what adverts you from doing the necessary thing that you have to do in the moment. And then when you follow that distraction, it leads to a lot of personal struggle. But what I think you're talking about is something that it would be like the whole concept and the thing of what soothing is, of like I've had a really stressful day at work. I don't want to do any more work. I'm going to watch anime. That's going to soothe me. Some people might see that as a distraction, but I would argue and say, well, as long as, I have everything done that I'm doing for the day that like necessarily has to be done, and I go watch that anime, it's not a distraction. It's, just me soothing. Whereas I think that distraction would be, oh, I've got bills to pay. I'm gonna go watch anime instead and not pay my bills. Now, I want to go back to what you were saying though about it might not necessarily be right for that person at that time to be asking that question. Maybe it's better for them just to like soothe out and do whatever. that's soothing them. Or perhaps to maybe they are going on like something different and they are distracting themselves. And I'm not saying that's good, bad, right, or wrong, but it when you said that, I thought of something our friend Shiri said of everyone is learning the same lessons at a different time. So, like perhaps this person is, they're going to wake up from it and they'll find meaning in whatever it was that was, causing them to distract themselves and heal from it. At least I hope for anyone out there who's going through something like that.
I think there's just a difference in you're saying like you could uh, in what like what's coming before the distraction. Like you're saying, I think in order you have to do all these things on your to-do list. And if you don't, then that's a distraction because you know there's something you have to do or you should have
Hmm.
done.
I'm
But
saying like maybe you need to watch the anime, maybe you need to go soon. Action is diverting you from anything that might be necessary for you to do. I'm including those like things in that necessary like hey, sometimes you need to blow off steam or go and have fun or whatever it is. So I
right,
didn't
you're
interrupt you.
because you're like coming from it. I'm trying to explain what I'm hearing you say. That you're coming from it like you have to do these things. And so a distraction is like when you have to do something and you're not doing it. I'm saying this thing here could be whatever, and I still think it's a distraction. It could be something you have to do, but maybe you ran out of steam or don't have any more capability today. Maybe you're feeling shitty about all the other stuff that happened and you don't have like the brain power to do this thing you have to do. And then I
Mm.
think a distraction is still could be an appropriate response because you're like at a level in your body where you're just not capable or don't have the capacity or don't have the resources to do the thing.
Yeah, and perhaps too, that distractive thing could also be like maybe I just need to sleep, but I'm going to then force myself to do the work that I have to get done. And then that would be distracting from the sleep.
Yeah, that's just kind of like, to me, feels like it's confusing everything.
Well, I mean, okay, let's see if I could clarify. Um, you were saying as far as you having all of these things to do and but not having the energy to do them. So what would be best is that you rest and that you go and you sleep, maybe take a hot shower before you go to bed, whatever it is that's restful for you, but definitely sleep, like if you're that exhausted or tired. But instead, you distract yourself from that and you have that grind mentality of I got to get this work done, and so then you sacrifice your rest and your sleep in order to get those things that you have to do done. And so that would also be what distraction is. And I think that also leads to a lot of burnout. And then I know for me, when I get burned out, I question like what my meaning is. So full circle.
Yeah, I'm following it. I think what you were originally saying is that example, though, of I have to do this stuff, so I'm going to do it no matter what, versus I'm just going to distract myself today because I don't have the capacity to meet this. And it doesn't have to be sleep. It could just be, I told myself I was going to call so and so to have this conversation. But, I had this conversation with my boss this morning that like really took it out of me. So even though that was on my to-do list to call this person, I don't have the emotional or mental capacity to handle that right now. So I'm gonna just, and I'm also still feeling like from the thing that happened at work.
Mm.
So instead, I'm gonna, I could really use a cup of tea. and I will call that person tomorrow, right? It doesn't have to be like the distraction is a video game bad habit. Like there's nuance in all of it, right? It doesn't have to be all the time that like I'm distracted. I think, when you use the distraction as it becomes like the way you cope, then that is when it's more of like a, negative distraction versus I'm just going to distract myself because I can't deal with this right now. And later, after I'm like distracted myself, soothed myself, done like taking care of myself and built up the capacity or resource I need to confront or do that thing, then that's when I'll do it. Does that
Mhm.
make sense? That's kind of where I was
Yeah,
coming from with it.
it makes sense. And I want to tie it into meaning too, and the meaning crisis of, um, I think that is what you're talking about is honoring your energy, and the meaning in that is living well. And the other thing where you work yourself to the bone, and you ask yourself like, what is the meaning in that? We might say like, well, there is no meaning in that, but really the meaning in that is, you are working yourself to the bone, and not you personally, don't take it that way, um but you are working yourself to the bone, and you are burning yourself out. And so like, what is the meaning of all of that? Well, it's the meaning of overwork and then having to recover. And I mean, that was where the meaning would be. And so I think as far as the meaning crisis goes, we have to ask ourselves like, what is the meaning of this thing that we're doing? And hold on one second, I'm getting a knock at the door. I'll be right there. And we're back. So we were talking about asking uh, asking yourself, what is the meaning in what I'm doing, and having that be through everything that you're doing. It's a good mental exercise. I kind of want to do that to make a practice out of it.
Yeah, I think for me, it's more of like
But I
a
think that's
set it and
where
forget it.
yeah,
And then I think it all, again, it depends. Like, how much cleaning up have you done, right? It doesn't have to be like what is meaningful for me, but again, maybe it is just something that like is important to you. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like what is meaningful. What do I enjoy? What do I feel is worthwhile? What do I think is important for me to do? What is the impact I want to have? What is the influence I could possibly have on the people around me? I think there's other ways of asking yourself a very similar or a question that will get you started moving in a way that is more beneficial, right? Than just I think it started, you were saying, if everyone asked themselves that question and then did it, it would change the world. I'm sure it would if a lot of people did. And then I just had to start saying, I think there's also other ways to get there.
yeah. And I had to change the way I was thinking about it and agree with you and not be so one track minded. But
Yeah, and that's
yeah,
okay. I mean, I think that's like a typical quality that we could have,
yeah,
right? No one wants to feel like they're wrong, or I don't know, you just have to also take some space sometimes and see that there are other ways of looking at things or even discussing it. I mean, look how like nitty gritty we got into like the distraction piece, you
yeah.
know.
And I'm sure it all ties into like that meaning crisis, or thinking that there is a lack of meaning. Maybe it's just all in the mind.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I think there's always like different questions. Maybe if like that's the thing, if people just even started asking better questions or different questions of themselves,
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
necessarily one specific question.
Going
Because
back to
I
that
know that for
intention.
me, that's important. I at one point was like following this question that like led me, nowhere good. And I finally had to just give up. It's like give up living out that question. It's like this wasn't the right thing to be asking myself.
Hmm. Yeah, I find that question and like the question of what is the meaning of life kind of leads you to a dead end road. Doesn't really lead anywhere. But I don't know, maybe if you ask yourself that question long enough, maybe it presents the answer. I don't know.
I'm not really sure. Like from what I understand of meaning, I think it's something that you only could know after the fact. I mean, you could say what is important or right, what does have meaning, what seems to give my life purpose. Again, what do I all those things I had said, right? Like what kind of impact do I feel like I could make? What where are my skills? Where are my likes? I guess you could just look at the question from so many ways. Um, but I think like if you say what is the meaning of life, I feel like you could only look back and then interpret like what you think happened and what the point of that stuff happening is
Mm.
or
I
was.
think it might be both ways in terms of like you find it after, but if you ask yourself the question and you reframe it of what does it mean to live meaningfully? That's a different question than what is the meaning of life. And so, what does it mean to live meaningfully? Well, shamanically, when I look at what it means to live, you live out your decisions that you engage in. So, going back to the question of what does it mean to live meaningfully, that means you decide on something like I'm deciding to live healthy. And so then I engage in that and I live healthy and I understand as I'm living that out that I am gaining the meaning of what it means and that knowledge of what it means to ultimately decide on things that are for my well-being. And I think that like the meaning you get from that is just living a good existence.
Yeah, living in an existence based on the choice that you or the decision, what's actually
Yeah.
like inherently what's inherent to what you want to bring forth. All right, I don't think
Yeah.
we're anywhere near a conclusion, but we do have to wrap up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, luckily we have many more episodes to go through.
Yeah, hopefully we'll make meaning of something,
Yeah, I hope so. I think we are. We're making meaning here. We're getting progress.
whatever that may be.
Yeah, even if it's just to understand, we don't fully understand.
Yeah, I don't know shit. I can't pretend like I do.
Yep, nope, I don't know either. But
No.
it's been fun.
Yeah. Enjoyment. Enjoy. All right. Well, thank you for listening, watching, receiving, maybe laughing along with us. Do all of the things like and comment and subscribe. What do you think a meaningful life is? What is it to live meaningfully? Or comment on whatever you want to comment on. Something else that caught your attention, let us know. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.